building wealth, it just sounds so complicated, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Like
totally.
full of jargon, confusing charts, endless debates about what strategy is best. It feels like you need a finance degree or, I don't know, some guru on speed dial.
Right. Just to even get started.
But what if it didn't have to be like that? What if the path to, financial independence was actually, well, simple?
That simple path is exactly what J.L. Collins lays out in his book, The Simple Path to Wealth. And what's really cool is how it even came about.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't like a formal guide at first. It actually started as letters he wrote to his daughter, just trying to explain money and investing in a way she,
Makes sense. Less intimidating.
totally. And those letters turned into a blog, which got really popular and then eventually became this book.
And you can kind of feel that origin in the book itself, can't you? I mean, the source material says it's not your typical dry finance book.
Not at all.
Oh.
It deliberately avoids that old style.
Yeah.
Uses fun analogies,
Yeah.
like comparing the market to a beer mug with foam.
The beer and foam. I like that one.
Yeah, or metaphors about fire and just good stories to make the point stick. It's meant to be, well, enjoyable and definitely actionable.
Approachable.
Exactly. And the big idea, the sort of counterintuitive thing Collins says, is that building wealth is simple. Now, that doesn't mean it's always easy, emotionally speaking.
Right. Sticking with it is the hard part.
Precisely. So our mission here in this deep dive is to cut through to the absolute core principles. We're pulling out the most crucial takeaways to give you that essential roadmap Collins offers.
Okay. And we'll uncover some surprising bits and give just enough context so these lessons really sink in. All right, let's jump into this simple path Collins is talking about.
Okay, so at its most basic, the book's main point is pretty straightforward. Financial independence comes from, well, sensible spending, saving a really high percentage of your income, like consistently,
Okay.
and then investing that money simply, mostly in low-cost index funds.
And one of the first big concepts he brings up is FU money, which is, it's a jarring name.
It is, yeah.
But the idea behind it is actually pretty profound, isn't it? It's not really about having millions stashed away.
No, not necessarily. FU money, the way Collins sees it, it's about having enough of a financial cushion that you get freedom. You get control over your life choices.
Right.
It's the money that lets you say F you to a bad situation, maybe negotiating better terms at work, or turning down a project you hate, or just quitting a job that's making you miserable.
Or just deciding how you spend your time, which is huge.
That's the ultimate goal, really. Your time is your most valuable asset.
He even shares his own story about this from when he was young, which really makes the point. He hit this first stage at like 25. With only $5,000 saved.
Yeah, just $5,000, which sounds like nothing today for FU money, right? You'd been earning maybe $10,000 a year for a couple of years.
So how did that small amount actually give him power?
Well, it immediately gave him leverage. Because he had that cushion, he wasn't totally dependent on the next paycheck. So he felt bold enough to ask his boss for 4 months off unpaid to go travel.
Wow, 4 months unpaid back then.
Yeah, totally unheard of. But because he could walk away if they said no, he got it. And even better, he negotiated a month of paid vacation going forward, too.
That's amazing, just from having that small safety net.
It fundamentally shifted his relationship with his work, with his life.
It really shows it's about the feeling of control, maybe more than the specific dollar amount, especially early on. And the book talks about how this mindset helped with bigger choices later, too, right?
Oh, absolutely. He and his wife decided she'd become a stay-at-home mom when their daughter was 2.
Yeah.
And this was during a time when he wasn't even earning a regular income himself. He was looking into buying a business.
That must have taken some financial confidence.
For sure. He calls it the best purchase they ever made because it gave them the freedom to prioritize their family how they wanted to.
And the source mentions something fascinating there. Even with neither of them working in a traditional sense for about 3 years, their net worth actually went up.
Yes, which is just a perfect illustration of reaching financial independence. Once you hit that point, your assets are working for you. They're generating wealth on their own, separate from your job. Your time truly becomes your own.
Okay, so saving and investing, that's the engine building this freedom. But what's the biggest roadblock? What does Collins say just stops people cold from even getting started?
Oh, hands down, it's debt. Collins is incredibly strong on this. Like, zero ambiguity.
Doesn't mince words.
Not at all. He sees debt, especially consumer debt like credit cards, as just vicious. Pernicious, a destroyer of your ability to build wealth. He's really clear. Carrying debt should not be normal.
Vicious and pernicious. That's pretty intense language. But what about things like mortgages or student loans? People often call that good debt, right? Necessary sometimes.
That's a fair question, and yeah, he does address it. He acknowledges some debt might be less destructive than, say, 25% interest credit cards.
Yeah.
But his whole philosophy for getting financially free fast is about minimizing all debt.
Why is he so against it across the board?
Well, a few core reasons. First, it just eats away at your lifestyle.
Yeah.
Right? All that money going to interest payments isn't going to savings or, stuff you actually enjoy. Second, it basically enslaves you to your job.
Because you have to make those payments.
Exactly. You lose your options. And third, the psychological weight is huge. He talks about the shame, the guilt, feeling helpless, compares it to addiction sometimes, and how it can even lead to weird cycles, like spending more to feel better momentarily.
Wow. Okay. So he frames it like a real crisis, not just, managing monthly payments.
Definitely.
So if you are in debt, what's the first step? What does he say to do?
He says it needs immediate, emergency level attention.
Mm.
Paying it off is priority number one. First step is simple, but you got to do it. List out every single debt you have. Everything.
Okay. Get it all down on paper.
Yep. Then, and this is tough but crucial, you have to cut out all non-essential spending. He gives examples like the $5 coffees, the $20 dinners out, the $12 cocktails. It adds up so fast.
The little leaks.
Exactly. All that money you free up needs to go straight towards attacking what he calls the debt flames, the things burning up your future wealth.
And how do you know which debt flame to put out first?
You rank them by interest rate. Highest interest rate gets all the extra money. Pay just the minimum on everything else. Pour every spare cent onto that highest rate debt until it's gone. Then move to the next highest.
Like a focused attack.
Totally. Snowballing the payments onto the next one.
Does he give any guidance on, when it makes sense to maybe invest instead of paying off low interest debt?
Yeah, he gives a very rough guideline. If the interest rate is over, say 5%, paid off ABED, ADIAP, it's really hard to guarantee an investment return higher than that, especially after tax. That's a guaranteed return.
Makes sense.
If it's under 3%, he leans towards investing first, let compounding work. Between 3 and 5%, the math gets closer. He says do what feels right. But honestly, his bias is still usually towards getting rid of the debt because of the psychological freedom and reduced risk.
And what about those specific good debts like mortgages and student loans? Still cautious.
Still very cautious. For financial independence, he says get the least house you need, not the most house the bank says you can afford. A huge mortgage is just a huge anchor holding you back.
Right.
And on student loans, he makes a really interesting point. He argues the easy availability of that loan money has actually just allowed colleges to jack up prices like crazy.
Oh, interesting. Like it fueled inflation and tuition.
Yeah, the source notes this huge jump in costs, way beyond normal inflation. He thinks it's kind of warped the whole point of higher education, away from learning towards just being job training, solely to justify the insane cost and the debt people take on.
So debt is the emergency. Handle that first. Once that money's freed up, where does the real power for wealth building come from?
That's where saving and compounding kick in. Collins really hammers home the importance of a high savings rate, like really high. He suggests aiming for 50% of your income is perfectly doable once you're debt-free.
50%. Wow, okay. That sounds ambitious for most people. Can we pause on that? How do you even get your head around saving half your income?
It's definitely a mindset shift. You have to stop seeing saving as, deprivation. Instead, see it as buying your future freedom. Every dollar saved gets you closer.
And there's a double benefit to saving so much, right?
Exactly. That's key.
Yep.
Benefit one, you fundamentally learn to live on way less. And since your spending determines how much you need to be financially independent, that's huge. Benefit two, you obviously have way more money to invest, which just turbocharges the whole process.
And that investment is where the magic of compounding happens.
Absolutely. Compounding. It's where your money earns returns, and then those returns start earning their own returns. It snowballs.
Can you give an example?
Yeah. Collins uses one just for illustration based on historical averages. Say you inherit $35,000. If you just invest it and leave it alone, it could potentially grow to over $2 million in about 36 years without adding another dime.
Seriously? Just from compounding?
Yeah. Now imagine you're also adding that high savings rate, like 50% of your income month after month, year after year. The source says the results become even more dramatic. That's the engine right there, letting your money work for you over time.
Okay, so you've tackled debt, you're saving like crazy. Where do you actually put the money so it can do this compounding thing? This is where people get intimidated, right? Investing seems complex.
It seems complex, but
Yeah.
Collins argues sound investing is really not that complicated. His main recommendation: low-cost, broad-based index funds.
And he has a favorite example he uses a lot, the one everyone associates with the book.
Yep, you got it. VTSAX. That's the ticker for the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund. He uses it as shorthand for basically owning the entire U.S. stock market.
So when you buy VTSAX, you own a tiny piece of what, like thousands of companies?
Pretty much. The source has around 3,700 publicly traded U.S. businesses, a tiny slice of almost everything.
And this is where his beer versus foam analogy comes in handy again.
It's such a great analogy. So think of a mug of beer, the actual beer. That's the real economy. The businesses making things, selling things, earning profits, growing. That's the substance, the long-term value.
Okay, the beer is the real stuff.
Right. The foam on top, that's all the day-to-day market noise. The price going up and down, the news headlines, the predictions from guys on TV, the guru forecasts, all that froth.
The stuff that makes people freak out and sell at the wrong time.
Exactly. Collins says serious investors need to focus on the beer, the underlying businesses driving long-term growth, and learn to completely ignore the foam. The foam is just temporary distraction. It's the beer that pushes the market higher over decades.
And index funds like VTSAX help you focus on the beer because they're kind of self-cleansing. Is that the term he uses?
Yeah, self-cleansing is a great way to put it. With a broad index fund, you don't need to worry about picking the next big winner or avoiding the company that's going to fail.
How does that work?
Well, as companies stumble and shrink, they just naturally become a smaller part of the index, or they drop out entirely. And as new successful companies rise up, they automatically get added and become a bigger piece. You just ride the overall wave of economic growth without having to constantly reevaluate individual stocks.
Okay, so the path seems clear. Ditch debt, save hard, buy something like VTSAX, ignore the noise. But if it's really that simple, why do so many people struggle with investing? Why do they lose money or just not get good returns?
Yeah, that's a huge part of the book. Collins spends a lot of time explaining why people fail. There are a few main reasons. First, and probably the biggest one, trying to time the market.
Buying high, selling low.
Classic mistake. People get greedy when the things are up and buy in, then they panic when the market drops and sell everything at the bottom, locking in losses. The source even mentions studies showing our brains just aren't wired for market volatility. We react to short-term threats, not long-term patience.
And the news and gurus feed right into that panic.
Exactly. That's the second reason. Listening to gurus and the financial media noise. Carlins calls it useless at best and actively harmful to your wealth and sanity at worst. It just encourages bad behavior.
Okay, what else trips people up? Trying to be smarter than the market.
That's number 3. Trying to pick individual stocks or paying big bucks for actively managed mutual funds that claim they can beat the market. Collins argues it's incredibly hard, almost impossible, to do that consistently over the long term, even for most professionals.
He has that analogy, right? Are you Warren Buffett or Bruce Lee?
Yeah. His point is, unless you are uniquely gifted and willing to dedicate your entire life to mastering stock picking like Buffett or martial arts like Bruce Lee, why take the risk? Stick with the simple, low-risk, proven strategy of indexing. Trying to beat the market is like trying a fancy kick in a real fight. If you're not an expert, you're probably just going to fall down.
And then there are the fees associated with trying to be clever.
That's the fourth killer: costs. People massively underestimate how much high fees eat away at their returns over time. Actively managed funds can have expense ratios that are way, way higher than index funds. Collins calls fees a devil's ball and chain.
Whereas something like VTSAX is super cheap.
Incredibly cheap. Because Vanguard is owned by its fund holders, it operates at cost. So VTSAX's expense ratio is tiny, like 0.03% or something. Compare that to 1% or more for many active funds. Over 30 or 40 years, that difference in fees is astronomical. It can literally be hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Wow. So the simplicity of index funds isn't just easier. It's actually often better financially because you keep more of your money. Just put it in the big basket and leave it alone.
That's the core idea. Collins believes that for most people, the more you watch your investments, the more you tinker, the more you trade, the worse your results will be. Because it just triggers all those psychological biases that make us bad investors.
But okay, leaving it alone is the hard part, right? Because the market isn't a smooth ride up. Collins calls it a wild and rocky ride. How do you handle that?
Yeah, he's super upfront about that. The market is volatile. Crashes, corrections, downturns, they aren't weird, black swan events. They were normal, expected parts of investing history.
Like 2008 or the dot-com bust or even further back?
Exactly. He lists examples: 74, 75, 87, the tech bubble, 9/11, 2008. They happen. They will happen again. That's a certainty.
So step one is just accepting that.
Accepting volatility is normal, yeah.
Yeah.
And then internalizing the crucial historical truth he shows with long-term charts. Despite everything, wars, recessions, pandemics, you name it, the stock market always eventually recovers and always trends upward over the long haul.
Always. That's a strong claim.
Historically, yes, the overall trend is powerfully positive.
But living through a drop of 20%, 30%, maybe even 50%, that sounds terrifying. Takes real guts to not panic.
That's the absolute crux of it. That's the psychological challenge where most people fail. Collins says your success or failure hinges entirely on what you do during those crashes.
So what do you do?
His advice: toughen up. Seriously. Learn to ignore the panic, tune out the media screaming the world is ending, and just stay. Of course.
Don't sell.
Absolutely do not sell in a panic. In fact, he says do the opposite of what your fear is telling you.
Meaning,
if you can, keep adding money during the downturn. See it as a sale, a gift, he calls it. You're buying shares of great companies cheaper than you could before.
buying on sale. That reframes it completely.
It does. Now, he acknowledges the 1929 crash was a uniquely awful, big, ugly event, a 90% drop. But even that, historically, was survivable for investors who stayed put. Severe downturns are part of the deal, not the end of investing. The market comes back. Your job is just to hang on.
Okay. So, no debt, save tons, invest simply in index funds, stay tough during downturns. How does this look in practice? Like, how do you actually set up your portfolio? What about stocks versus bonds?
Right, asset allocation. Collins talks about the mix of stocks and bonds mainly as a choice based on your personal tolerance for risk, your temperament, and your goals. It's not some rigid rule based only on your age.
So what's the general recommendation?
Well, for the accumulation phase, when you're younger and focused on growth and you have decades ahead of you, he often suggests going 100% stocks, like just VTSAX, for maximum growth potential.
If you can handle the bigger swings that come with 100% stocks.
Exactly. That's the big if. You have to be able to sleep at night during those downturns we just talked about. If you can't, then 100% stocks might not be right for you, even if you're young.
And for older folks or people in retirement?
Then the focus shifts more towards preserving wealth and having a smoother ride. So a mix is usually better. He shares his own allocation as an example, something like 75% VTSAX for continued growth, maybe 20% in a total bond market index fund like VBTLX from Vanguard, and 5% in cash.
What do the bonds do? Just smooth things out?
Pretty much. Bonds usually don't move perfectly in sync with stocks, so they dampen the volatility. They provide a little income, maybe offer some protection if deflation ever became a thing. Again, the key is using simple, low-cost index funds for bonds too.
Okay, so you decide on your mix, VTSAX, maybe some VBTLX. Where do you actually hold these funds? You mentioned buckets earlier.
Right. The buckets are the different types of accounts. Things like your 401k at work, an IRA, a Roth IRA, maybe a regular taxable brokerage account. These aren't investments themselves. They're just the containers that hold your investments, like VTSAX.
And each bucket has different tax rules.
Exactly. And using the right buckets is really important for maximizing your returns over the long run because of those tax advantages.
So what's the priority?
Generally, you want to max out your tax advantage buckets first, especially if your employer offers a match on your 401k contributions. That is literally free money. You have to get the full match.
Even if the funds in the 401k aren't perfect, like slightly higher fees?
Collins argues that usually, yes. The tax advantage plus the free money from the match almost always outweighs slightly higher fees within the plan, though he definitely recommends rolling old 401ks over to an IRA when you leave a job. That gives you way more control and access to the best low-cost funds, like Vanguard's.
Makes sense. What about later in life? Things like required minimum distributions.
Yeah, RMDs. That's when the government makes you start taking money out of your traditional pre-tax retirement accounts, like 401ks and traditional IRAs. Starts at age 73 now for most people.
And that can be a tax headache, right?
It can definitely bump you into higher tax brackets in retirement. This is where Roth accounts, Roth IRAs, Roth 401ks really shine. You contribute after-tax money, but then qualified withdrawals in retirement are completely tax-free. And the original owner doesn't have RMDs on Roth IRAs.
So Roth conversions could make sense sometimes, paying the tax now to move money.
Potentially, yeah. Especially if you're in a lower tax bracket temporarily, maybe between jobs or early retirement before Social Security kicks in, it's a strategy to consider.
And you mentioned one other account type he highlights, something often overlooked.
The HSA, Health Savings Account. If you have a qualifying high-deductible health plan, Collins sees HSAs as this amazing, triple tax advantage investment vehicle.
Triple tax advantage, how?
Okay, so contributions are tax-deductible going in. The money grows tax-free,
Right.
and withdrawals are tax-free if used for qualified medical expenses.
Okay, that's pretty good.
But the real power move, he suggests, is if you can afford to pay your current medical bills out of pocket, just save your receipts and let the HSA money stay invested, ideally in index funds, and compound tax-free for years, even decades.
And then you can pay yourself back later.
Exactly. You can reimburse yourself tax-free using those old receipts whenever you want. Or, after age 65, you can pull money out for any reason, not just medical. You'd pay regular income tax on the earnings then, kind of like a traditional IRA, but still potentially super valuable, especially since there are no RMDs currently on HSAs. It's incredibly flexible.
Wow, okay. So the path looks like kill debt, save aggressively, invest simply in index funds inside the right tax advantage buckets, 401k, IRA, Roth, HSA, and then just stay disciplined through the market's ups and downs. What's the end game? What does following this path lead to?
It leads to financial independence. Collins defines that as the point where your investment assets are big enough that a safe percentage of their value can cover your annual living expenses indefinitely.
And there's a rule of thumb for figuring that out.
Yeah, the common guideline he discusses is the 4% rule, which came out of something called the Trinity study. Basically, historical data suggests that if you withdraw about 4% of your portfolio's value in the first year of retirement and then adjust that amount for inflation each year after, there was a very high probability, like 96% in the simulations, that your money would last for at least 30 years.
So if you need $40,000 a year to live, you need 25 times that, or $1 million invested.
That's the math, yeah. Assets equal 25 times your annual spending.
But he's careful about that 4% number, right? It's not like a magic button you press and forget.
Oh, absolutely not. He stresses it's a guideline, not some rigid, unbreakable rule. Sensible flexibility is crucial. You shouldn't feel forced to pull out exactly 4% if the market just crashed 30%.
Maybe spend a little less that year.
Exactly. You might trim spending in down years to let your portfolio recover. And maybe you could spend a little more in years after the market has soared. It requires periodically checking in, maybe once a year, reassessing your spending needs and your portfolio value.
So ultimately, getting to that number, achieving FI, it's not just about the money itself. It ties back to that rich, free life idea from the book's subtitle.
That is the absolute core of it all. Reaching financial independence isn't the finish line. It's the tool. It's what buys you options. It buys you freedom. That's the most valuable thing.
Freedom to choose how you live.
Precisely. The source shares some cool little stories, like a guy named Mook who just decided to go build hotels in Tahiti with zero experience just because he could. Or these partners who had a sailboat and would rotate, like one works for a year while the other sails, then they swap.
Living life on their own terms.
Yeah. Collins basically says once you hit FI, the only real limits left are your imagination and your fears.
And that core message comes through again and again. Nothing you can buy with money is more valuable than the freedom that money can secure for you.
It's the ultimate goal. Control over your own life, not being chained to a paycheck or crushed by debt, being in the driver's seat.
This has been a fantastic deep dive into the simple path to wealth. Just to quickly recap those absolute core steps Collins lays out for you, the listener. First, attack debt like it's an emergency. Get rid of it. Second, save a lot. A really high percentage of your income, learning to live on less and fueling your investments. Third, invest simply. Low-cost, broad index funds like VTSAX are your friend. Ignore the noise. And fourth, maybe the hardest part, stay the course. Toughen up for those inevitable market downturns and trust the long-term process.
Yeah, following that path, which sounds simple but takes real discipline, that's how you build options. That's how you buy your freedom.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you to chew on, drawing from what we've discussed. Collins makes this powerful argument that when you're saving and investing, market drops are actually a gift. They let you buy assets on sale. But we know most people's gut reaction is panic. So think honestly. How do you think you'd react if the market suddenly plunged 20 or 30% tomorrow? And what specific steps, what mental habits might you need to start building now to toughen up so you can actually stay the course and maybe even benefit from that volatility when it inevitably comes?